All right, so get this. A Delta plane crash landed in Toronto and ended up completely upside down on the runway. I know you're really into aviation safety. And this one is pretty crazy, especially with your trip coming up soon. Thankfully, everyone survived this one, which is amazing. We're going to be looking at a CBS Minnesota article today. They've got eyewitness accounts and statements from officials and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild scene for sure. Flipping a plane during landing,
Mm.
even in bad weather,
Yeah,
is a pretty rare thing. And a rare outcome, too, thankfully.
for sure. So let's break this down. Delta Flight 4819, operated by Endeavor Air, took off from Minneapolis, headed to Toronto. The incident happened on February 17th, 2025. Right around 1:15 p.m. Central Time as they were trying to land.
And we can't forget about the weather here. Imagine, like, blowing snow, reducing visibility to just 6 miles, winds gusting up to 37 miles per hour, and a temperature of 17 degrees Fahrenheit. That's pretty brutal for landing a plane.
Definitely. That's got to be tough on the pilots, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. It affects everything. Runway conditions, instrument readings.
Right.
Blowing snow can create like a whiteout effect.
Yeah.
And that makes it really hard to judge distances and align the aircraft. Plus, in those temperatures, you have to be super careful about ice buildup on the wings and other surfaces. That can mess up the airflow and make it harder to control the plane.
Okay, so this plane is coming in for a landing in these terrible conditions, and then, boom, it flips over. There were 80 people on board, 76 passengers, and 4 crew members. What happened right after the crash?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. You have a plane upside down.
Uh-huh.
Passengers are probably scared and confused, and it's still snowing and freezing outside.
Mm-hmm.
But the airport's emergency team did a fantastic job. They got to the crash site within minutes, and they were able to get everyone out of the plane quickly.
Wow, that's incredible, especially with the plane being upside down. It's like something out of a movie.
I know, right? It was a textbook response.
Okay.
And it shows how important the ground crews are for aviation safety. We usually talk about pilots and technology, but these crews are essential in emergencies.
Yeah, they really don't get enough credit. 17 passengers had to go to the hospital. But luckily, no one died. That really shows how effective the emergency response was, right?
It really does. You have to think about what they had to deal with. The initial shock of the crash, the weather conditions, putting out any fires and getting everyone off a flipped-over plane. They probably saved lives that day.
Definitely. They deserve a ton of credit. We usually only hear about the tragedies. But this is a good reminder that these professionals are incredibly skilled and dedicated.
I agree. And, while it's great that there were no deaths, we have to remember the people who were injured. 1 child and 2 adults were critically injured, and others had less serious injuries.
Yeah, I can't imagine what everyone was going through. Even if you weren't seriously hurt physically, to be in a plane crash like that must be so traumatic.
No doubt about it. The mental impact of something like this can last a long time, and it's something that needs to be addressed along with the physical injuries.
So what happens next? After everyone is safe, what are the next steps?
Well, the investigation starts right away. The Transportation Safety Board of Canada, the NTSB here in the U.S., and the FAA are all going to be involved. They'll be looking at everything, the weather conditions, pilot error, any mechanical problems with the plane.
So we can figure out what went wrong and prevent it from happening again.
Exactly. It's
Oh.
not about blaming anyone,
Yeah.
but about understanding what happened and making things safer in the future.
Like putting together a giant puzzle to see the whole picture.
Exactly. They're going to look at the black boxes, those things that record flight data and cockpit conversations. They'll look at the wreckage, interview witnesses,
Mm.
and review weather reports, maintenance records, all sorts of things.
Wow, that's a lot. And this whole thing must have been a mess for the airport too, right?
Oh, definitely.
Oh.
They had to close 2 runways at Toronto Pearson for part of the day. So there were delays and cancellations all over the place. Plus, they had to cancel all the remaining Delta flights in and out of Pearson for the day.
Ugh. That sounds like a nightmare for travelers. Being stuck at the airport with all that uncertainty.
For sure. It's a huge disruption, and it shows how connected everything is in the aviation system. One incident can have a big impact on so many people.
It's a good reminder to be patient when you're traveling,
It is.
especially in the winter.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And, despite all the chaos and disruption, there was a lot of support and compassion from different people.
Yeah, I saw that in the article too. What stuck out to you?
Well, Delta's CEO, Ed Bastian, quickly came out and said he was concerned about everyone involved. He said the airline was committed to supporting the passengers and crew, which is really important in these situations.
Yeah, it's good to see that kind of leadership, taking responsibility and acknowledging how this affects people. Did anyone else say anything?
Yeah. The Association of Flight Attendants, CWA, also put out a statement. They confirmed that no one died, and they asked everyone to avoid speculating about what happened, which is easier said than done in the age of social media.
That's true. It's a good reminder to wait for the facts before jumping to conclusions. What about officials in Toronto? Did anyone from the city comment?
Yeah. The Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, said he was relieved there were no deaths. And he said the province would support those who were affected.
It's good to see that kind of unity and support after something like this.
I agree. It reminds us that even with all the technical and logistical stuff, this is really about people's lives being disrupted and the emotional toll that comes with it.
It makes you think about this in a bigger context, too. We've seen a few other plane accidents lately. Does that worry you at all?
I get it. It's natural to feel uneasy when we see a bunch of accidents. It makes you question if flying is safe. But it's important to remember that flying is still one of the safest ways to travel. These accidents are tragic, but they're still rare. And every accident is investigated thoroughly to find out why it happened and how to prevent it from happening again.
That's good to hear. But I am curious about those other recent accidents. Do you think there's any connection, or is it just a coincidence?
Well, that's something we can look into more deeply. Remember that mid-air collision between an American Airlines plane and a Black Hawk helicopter at Reagan National? Everyone on both aircraft died. It was awful.
Yeah, that one was really scary. It's hard to believe something like that could happen in such a controlled airspace.
It definitely reminded us that even in the most secure environments, there were still risks involved in flying. And then there was that Lear medical jet crash in Philadelphia. All 6 passengers and 1 person on the ground were killed.
It is unsettling to see these accidents happening so close together. Does it mean there's a bigger problem with safety?
It's definitely something to pay attention to. But again, we shouldn't jump to conclusions. Like I said, flying is statistically very safe,
Right.
and these accidents are still relatively rare.
Okay, so it makes sense to feel a little nervous after seeing these accidents. But we shouldn't overreact. But it does make you wonder why we notice these clusters of events, even if they might be random statistically.
Well, that's an interesting question. Our brains are wired to look for patterns, even when they might not be there. So when we hear about a plane crash, we tend to notice other similar news stories. And that makes it seem like there are more crashes than usual. It's like when you buy a new car and then you start seeing that same car everywhere.
I see. So it's our brains looking for patterns. And the media tends to focus on these kinds of events. So we end up feeling like there's more risk than there actually is.
That's right. And while it's important to stay informed about the risks, we should rely on data and evidence when thinking about the overall safety of flying.
So where do we go from here? We've talked about a lot, the details of the crash, the investigation, the bigger picture of aviation safety. What's the next thing we should explore?
Let's think about what happened right after the crash and really focus on how it affected the people involved. We know the airport was a mess, but what about the passengers and crew? How are they taken care of? And what kind of support did they get?
That's a great point. We talked about the physical injuries, but the emotional and psychological impact must have been huge. Let's dive into that in the next part of our deep dive.
So, picking up where we left off, let's try to imagine what it was like for the people on that plane. The fear and disorientation they must have felt when the plane flipped over and skidded to a stop.
I can't even imagine. I've been in some pretty bad turbulence before, and that was enough to make me nervous. To actually go through something like this must have been terrifying.
Absolutely. It's not just the physical impact of the crash,
Yeah.
but the sudden change, the confusion, not knowing what's happening. It's like a sensory overload that triggers your fight or flight response.
So right after the crash, what kind of help did the passengers and crew get? We know the emergency responders got there quickly, but what about the immediate care for everyone on board?
Well, that's where the training of those first responders really makes a difference. They're not only focused on getting people off the plane safely, but also on checking for injuries, providing basic medical care, and starting to address the emotional and psychological needs of everyone involved.
It's amazing how they can handle all of that in such a chaotic situation.
It really is. They have to stay calm and focused,
Well-
even though it's like a scene from a disaster movie.
We know 17 passengers were taken to the hospital with different types of injuries, but what about the mental and emotional trauma? How do you even begin to deal with the psychological impact of something like that?
That's a really important part of post-crash care, and it often gets overlooked. 1 child and 2 adults were critically injured. But even people with minor physical injuries can be traumatized by the experience. It's like an invisible injury that needs just as much attention as a broken bone.
So what kind of support is available for people who've been through something like this?
It depends on the airline and the location, but there are usually protocols in place to offer things like counseling services, trauma support groups, and other resources to help people cope with the emotional aftermath.
That makes sense. It's not just about taking care of physical injuries, but also about giving people the tools they need to heal mentally and emotionally.
Exactly. And it's not just about the passengers and crew either. Think about their families who are waiting for news, the air traffic controllers who saw it happen, the first responders who had to deal with the immediate aftermath. Trauma can affect a lot of people.
That's a good point. It shows that we need a more comprehensive approach to post-incident care, recognizing that the impact goes far beyond those who are on the plane. Speaking of impact, let's talk about the logistical side of things for a minute. The article mentioned that 2 runways at Toronto Pearson were closed for a while, causing all sorts of delays and cancellations.
Right, and that's just the beginning. When something like this happens, it creates a chain reaction of disruptions throughout the aviation system.
Like a domino effect. One plane goes down and suddenly flights are delayed or canceled all over the place. I remember being stuck at an airport once because of a snowstorm in another state. It was annoying, but I never really thought about the domino effect of weather delays.
It's easy to forget how connected everything is in aviation. Think about all the different parts. The airlines, the airports, air traffic control, ground crews, baggage handlers, passengers. It's all carefully coordinated. And one unexpected event can throw everything off.
So in this case, what were some of the logistical challenges they had to deal with?
Well, first of all, you've got those 2 runways closed. That means incoming flights have to be diverted, outgoing flights are delayed or canceled, and all those passengers need to be rebooked or accommodated somehow.
That sounds like a logistical nightmare.
It is. And then you have the investigation itself, which makes things even more complicated. They have to secure the record, collect evidence, and carefully examine the area to figure out what caused the crash.
So it's not just about getting things back to normal as quickly as possible. You also have to make sure the investigation can happen properly.
Exactly. It's a balancing act, and it shows how important it is to have clear procedures for managing these types of incidents. You have to minimize disruption while also ensuring safety and accountability.
It makes you realize that there's a lot going on behind the scenes when you hear those airport announcements about delays and cancellations.
Yeah, there are a lot of people working hard to keep things running smoothly.
So let's talk about the investigation itself. We know it involves the Transportation Safety Board of Canada, the NTSB, and the FAA. What exactly are they looking for, and how do they figure out what caused the crash?
It's a really interesting process, and it all starts with those black boxes we talked about earlier. You know, the ones that record flight data and cockpit conversations? They're actually bright orange, not black, so they're easier to find. And they contain a lot of important information.
So what kind of data is in those black boxes?
There are 2 main types of recorders. The flight data recorder, which tracks things like altitude, speed heading, and engine performance, and the cockpit voice recorder, which records conversations between the pilots and any other sounds in the cockpit.
It's like listening in on what happened before the crash.
Exactly. And these recordings are really valuable to investigators. They provide objective data that helps them reconstruct the flight path, analyze the pilot's decisions, and identify any potential problems or warning signs.
So they're not just listening to the conversations, but also looking at all the technical data to see if anything was unusual.
Right, and it's a very detailed process. Specialists download the data from the black boxes and analyze it. They can create visualizations and simulations of the flight to pinpoint key moments and potential contributing factors.
Wow, that sounds complicated. What other kinds of evidence do they look at?
They also examine the wreckage itself, looking for any signs of mechanical failure, structural damage, or impact patterns that might help them understand what happened.
Like trying to put together a giant 3D puzzle?
Exactly. They also review all sorts of records, weather reports, radar data, air traffic control communications, maintenance logs, pilot training records. They're looking for anything that might have contributed to the incident.
So they're really thorough. And I imagine they'll also be interviewing the pilots, the crew, and anyone who saw the crash landing.
Of course. Getting first-hand accounts is really important. It helps them confirm the physical evidence and get a more complete picture of what happened. They'll talk to everyone involved, from the air traffic controllers to the passengers.
That must be tough, having to relive those traumatic moments and try to remember everything. Do you think there's a chance that eyewitness accounts could be biased or inaccurate?
That's a good question. Human memory isn't perfect, and stress, trauma, and time can affect people's memories. So investigators use different techniques to reduce bias and make sure the information is accurate.
Like what?
Well, they might interview the same person multiple times, asking open-ended questions that encourage them to remember details without leading them. And they'll compare those accounts with other evidence to see if things match up.
So it's about being sensitive to the people involved, while also trying to gather accurate information.
Exactly.
So we've got the black boxes, the wreckage analysis, the interviews, the records review. That's a lot of work. It must take a while to go through all of that and figure out what happened.
You're right. These investigations can take months or even years. They want to be thorough and careful.
And while we wait for the official findings, it's natural to wonder what might have caused the crash. We know the weather was bad, with blowing snow, limited visibility, and strong winds. Do you think the weather was the main reason this happened?
It's definitely a major factor. We'll talk more about how weather affects aviation safety in the next part of our deep dive. But it's important to remember that there's usually not just one cause. It's often a combination of things that lead to an incident like this.
So it's not as simple as blaming the weather or the pilots or a mechanical problem. It's about understanding how all the pieces fit together.
Exactly. And that's why these investigations are so important. By carefully analyzing the evidence, we can learn from these incidents and make flying safer in the future.
It's a reminder that aviation safety is an ongoing process.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's talk more about the weather. We know it was pretty bad in Toronto, but I want to understand how weather like that really affects flying. You mentioned blowing snow, limited visibility, freezing temperatures. Can you explain why those things are so challenging for pilots?
Yeah, it's like imagine driving in blizzard, but you're in a plane going really fast with very little room for error, and the weather is constantly changing.
Okay, so let's start with blowing snow. Obviously, it makes it hard to see, but how does that actually affect a pilot trying to land a plane?
Well, it's like this. You're trying to land, but you can barely see the runway. That's what pilots have to deal with in heavy snow. Blowing snow can create this thing called a whiteout, where the ground and the sky kind of blend together, and it makes it super hard to judge distance's altitude.
Yeah.
And whether the plane is lined up with the runway.
It's like trying to thread a needle in a snowstorm. And I guess it's not just about what the pilot can see out the window, right?
Right. Blowing snow can also mess with the plane's instruments, especially the ones that use visual cues or radar. For example, the altimeter, which tells you how high you are. It might give you the wrong reading if the snow is reflecting the signal back. And the radar system, which helps pilots navigate and avoid obstacles. It can be disrupted by heavy snow, too, so it's harder for the pilot to see what's around them.
So it affects both what the pilot can see and how well the instruments work. What about freezing temperatures? We all know ice is bad for planes, but can you explain why?
Sure. So when ice forms on the wings and other parts of the plane, it messes up the smooth airflow that's needed for the plane to fly properly. It's like trying to surf on a board covered in sandpaper. It creates drag and makes it much harder to control the plane.
So the plane has to work harder to stay in the air when there's ice.
Yeah. And that puts more stress on the engines. It uses more fuel and reduces the overall performance of the plane. And if there's too much ice, it can even cause a stall, which means the plane suddenly loses lift and drops out of the sky.
That sounds scary. Have there been any accidents where ice was a major factor?
Yes, unfortunately. Like Air Florida Flight 90, which crashed into the Potomac River in 1982. Ice on the wings was a big reason why that happened.
That's a reminder of how important it is to deal with ice properly. So what do they do to prevent ice buildup?
They have these things called de-icing and anti-icing procedures. Before a plane takes off in cold weather, they spray it with special fluids to remove any ice that's already there and to stop new ice from forming.
So it's more than just a quick spray with a hose.
Oh yeah, it's a whole process. They use special equipment trained personnel. And they have to follow strict safety rules. The type of fluid, the way they apply it, the timing, it all matters. And it can take a while, especially if there's a lot of snow or ice.
Wow. It's amazing what they do to keep flights safe, even in bad weather. Okay, let's talk about wind now. The article mentions strong winds and gusts in Toronto. How does wind, especially crosswinds, affect landing a plane?
Wind can be really tricky in aviation. You never know what it's going to do. It can change direction suddenly, and it can cause turbulence and instability, especially when you're landing. Crosswinds are the worst because they push the plane sideways, which makes it harder to line up with the runway.
It sounds like trying to land a boat on a rough lake.
Exactly. Pilots have ways to deal with crosswinds. They adjust the rudder and ailerons, they might increase engine power, and sometimes they even crab the plane, which means flying at an angle to the runway to counter the wind. But it takes a lot of skill to land safely in those conditions.
So, besides de-icing and pilot training, is there anything else they can do to reduce these weather-related risks?
Well, one of the most important things is good weather forecasting. Meteorologists use computer models and real-time data to predict the weather. So airlines and pilots can make informed decisions about flight routes, delays, cancellations, and any precautions they need to take.
So it's all about being prepared.
Exactly. And if they can't avoid bad weather, airports have special systems to help planes land safely, like Instrument Landing Systems or ILS. They use radio signals to guide pilots down to the runway, even when visibility is low.
That's good to know. Are there any other technologies or procedures that help?
Yeah, they use ground-based radar to track planes and monitor weather. Planes also have weather avoidance systems on board, which give pilots real-time information about storms, turbulence, and other hazards, so they can adjust their flight path if needed. And of course, there's constant communication between pilots, air traffic controllers, and meteorologists. They're all working together to ensure safety.
It sounds like a real team effort.
It is, and it's something that's always improving. We learn from every incident and adapt to new challenges. The Delta crash landing in Toronto was unfortunate, but it will definitely teach us things that can help make flying safer in bad weather.
It's good to know that they investigate these incidents thoroughly
Exists.
and that they use what they learn to improve safety for everyone.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a really interesting deep dive. We started with a story about a plane flipping over, and we ended up talking about weather technology, human factors, and all the complex systems that keep us safe when we fly.
It just goes to show that even a normal flight is a complicated thing. It relies on engineering, human skill, and coordination. And while accidents like the Delta crash can be scary, they also show how resilient the aviation industry is and how committed everyone is to safety.
I think that's a great takeaway. Thanks for taking us through this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
Yeah.
And to everyone listening, fly safe.